Well, it's time now for Perspective, and we're sticking with our top story today, those inconclusive election results out of Israel, which on Sunday went to the polls for the fourth time in less than 2 years, with Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister, and his allies failing to win an outright majority once again. Well, my guest today is Amnon Aran, Senior Lecturer in International Politics at City University in London. He's also the author of Israeli Foreign Policy Since the End of the Cold War. Thank you very much for being with us here on France 24 today. Now, no one bloc has a clear majority, although both Netanyahu and Yair Lapid say they see a path to a majority. Does any of what we're seeing today come as a surprise to you?
No, it doesn't. This is the fourth election in 2 years that Israel has underwent, and it is really fueled by quite fundamental divisions in the country and in the political system. The first one, of course, surrounding Mr. Netanyahu, the anti-Bibi bloc, demanding that he does not serve as Israeli Prime Minister when he's under trial. Second division is a very clear and contrasting views about how Israeli democracy should look like. Quite a few of the parties supporting Mr. Netanyahu not giving the recognition to Israel's minorities which the other side would like to see. And of course, a third division surrounding the social contract. That means many of the parties supporting Mr. Netanyahu, especially ultra-Orthodox, wanting to keep their privileges via child benefits and exemptions from the military, whereas the centre-left parties and some of the liberal-right parties demanding that those privileges end. And those divisions have really fueled the last four elections, including this one.
Nonetheless, a lot of voters were undecided right up until election day. Why was that, do you think?
Well, I think a lot of voters were undecided, but they were undecided within their own blocs. So in the end, some of the votes that may have gone to the larger parties, such as There Is Hope of Yair Lapid and Likud's as well, ultimately went to a smaller party within their own bloc. In other words, the centre-right or even the extreme right and the centre-left and the far left. But there wasn't a lot of movement between the blocs, so the movement was predominantly within the bloc. So in that sense, the indecision was not that significant.
Now, many in Israel saw this election as something of a referendum on Netanyahu himself. Netanyahu, who has, of course, presided over a world-beating vaccination rollout. Just how significant do you think Netanyahu's handling of the pandemic has been in the run-up to the election?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I think ultimately what we see is that the Israeli electorate did not reward Netanyahu significantly for how he handled the pandemic, given that the result is quite similar to the elections prior to the pandemic. But at the same time, the electorate did not penalize him for standing trial. So it seems, at least at the first instance, that perhaps the successful management of the pandemic helped Netanyahu on the margins, but the fundamental divisions that still exist in Israeli politics and society were still underpinning the election campaign and are likely to underpin a future election campaign should we reach that point.
Now, Yair Lapid, of course, does head up the Israeli opposition. As we mentioned before, he does still think there's a pathway to him securing a majority in the Knesset. What do you think are the main ways in which the two leading candidates diverge when it comes to international policy?
So I think, interestingly, there is, first of all, some points of agreement. So both sides actually agree on adopting a hard-line stance against Iran, and both sides would probably try and enlarge the circle of peace with Arab countries in a similar vein to the peace agreements Mr. Netanyahu has managed to achieve very recently, the Abraham Accords. Where the main divergence perhaps lies is firstly in relation to the Palestinians, a centre-right, or rather an extreme-right government under Mr. Netanyahu, probably the most extreme and most racist government that Israel would have had or will have if he forges a partnership with religious Zionism, would keep the Palestinian-Israeli peace process dormant as it is now, whereas a centre-left coalition might try and revive that, although that is not clear. And I think another divergence, which perhaps is quite interesting, is the different views that both governments represent towards Israel's traditional Western allies, and even part of the Jewish community abroad. A government led by Mr. Netanyahu and his ultra-right and ultra-Orthodox partners would be incompatible with the majority of at least Jewish communities in Western countries such as Western Europe and the vast majority of the liberal Jews in the United States, whereas Mr. Lapid's government would be much more compatible with those groups. But also a government led by Mr. Netanyahu, ultra-Orthodox, racist parties like Religious Zionism would find it increasingly difficult to hold the view that Israel has shared values with the West, given that main leaders of Religious Zionism, such as, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, has been on record saying that he is a proud homophobe, to quote him. And number 3 on the list, Mr. Itamar Ben-Gvir, is a disciple of the late Rabbi Kahana, who in the 1980s was banned from Israeli politics on grounds of his racist views. So I think those would be the main fault lines.
And are there any signs that that lurch to the right by Likud and Netanyahu's allies has alienated any of Likud's traditional base?
Well, Netanyahu's lurch to the right actually is, I think, representative of perhaps the broader new makeup of the Israeli right. What we might consider as the old Likud, a sort of nationalist liberal party, really was represented in Mr. Sa'ar's party, New Hope, and that party did very badly, at least suggesting at this point that the traditional Likud makeup really has been pushed aside to the margins of the Israeli right. Conversely, Mr. Netanyahu's Likud, many of the representatives that came with him, and of course the ultra-Orthodox and ultra-right, and in some cases racist parties like Religious Zionism, ultra-Orthodox parties like Shas and United Torah Judaism, those parties really represent a very fundamentalist version of the Israeli right, more religious, far less tolerant than the Israeli right was, say, 30, 40 years ago, and really represents quite a shift in the center ground of the Israeli right over the last 10 or 15 years.
Now, we are running out of time, but there is one last question I'd like to ask you. Netanyahu and Donald Trump, of course, famously close, mutually supportive. Who does President Biden want to be leading the Knesset?
Well, my sense that the Biden administration would have a preference to Mr. Lapid. Mr. Lapid would be at least a potential partner to relaunch, or at least perhaps explore the possibility of an Israeli-Palestinian renewed peace process. Mr. Lapid would also be perhaps an easier partner to talk with surrounding the Biden's administration attempt to possibly renew the deal with Iran. Mr. Netanyahu and certainly his potential coalition partners would be a much more harder partner given their hardline stance on Iran, their uncompromising position towards the Palestinians. Having said all that, perhaps Netanyahu has a greater chance of forging yet another peace initiative with another Arab country, although I think that ultimately that possibility would be less significant for the Biden administration than the factors I mentioned just a moment ago.
Amnon Aran, a senior lecturer in international politics at City University in London, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us today on France 24.
Thank you, my pleasure.